of people make stuff more complex than they actually need. Counting lines of code is just stupid. There's no other word for it. If managers do that, they should be fired. It took me 40 years to write a single statement functions, basically. Most of the functions I write have a single statement. I don't have the time to make my life very complex. And the same goes for my code. Software development is a team sport. I cannot write code without my team. My team cannot write code without me. If you look at a team, it's that everybody holds a piece of the puzzle, right?
So welcome to this short interview, this short conversation we were going to have with Sander. So nice to meet you, nice that you're here. And to get to know you, I ask you, what do you usually do, Sander?
What I usually do is I write code. I've been doing that since 1978. That's probably way before most participants at the conference were born. I have 3 grown-up kids, and I have a girlfriend who's also a CTO, because I'm the CTO at this company called iBoot.com, e-commerce company. And next to that, I travel a bit because I do a lot of talks at international conferences.
So, Sander, I guess you've been to Berlin before. It's not your first visit.
No. I've been there many times before.
Since you'll be at the conference the whole week, you probably want to attend some other talks. Are you looking for particular topics you want to catch up on?
I do a lot of conferences, right? Which means I always see what is there to catch up. And that means that on different conferences, I look at different topics. I have a very broad area of interest. And in Berlin, it's mostly architecture. And there's lots of all this stuff, basically. I'll do a Java conference in the meantime. I've been doing architecture for a very long time, so I'm always interested to see what happens there. But I'm in a lucky opportunity to go to a lot of conferences, means I can see a lot of talks. And usually I open up my laptop and write code while I'm listening to people. So I can do those things at the same time, usually.
So since you are a kind of a conference tourist, people would
yeah.
Maybe use that word. What is it that you enjoy about speaking and being at conferences?
There's actually a lot of things. So first of all, I enjoy being on a stage. I like being on big stages, but I also like being talking to small groups of people, because that gives way more intimate interaction and lots of more feedback from people in the audience. And I always like to meet a lot of people. I like to meet the other speakers, of course, and I know quite a few of them. But I also very much like interacting with the attendees. So I usually walk around conferences, especially after my talks, and people usually find me and tell their stories. And I love hearing all those stories and talking to people and giving them maybe some advice, and maybe I can learn something from them as well. And of course, just to travel, just to be in a city, in another country, anywhere around the world usually, but that I also really, really appreciate. So there's lots of things that make conferences for me a very nice place to be, actually.
Let's talk a bit about your workshop. Do you often see people and teams struggle to stay in control of their microservice architecture?
Yes. It's the problem most companies have, right? So first of all, if you start doing microservice, you need to do it for the right reason. That goes for any architectural pattern, by the way, but it needs to actually solve a problem that you have, right? So a lot of people start doing them for the wrong reasons, because of problems they think they have, but they actually don't have, right? And there, of course, if you are solving problems that you actually don't have, scalability is often like, oh, we have scalability issues. And then if you ask deeper, a lot of companies actually do not have scalability issues, right? And that's the thing you need to ask first. And then the problem is that microservices architecture is not just one thing, right? It's not just you open a box and then you can start. There's a whole lot of things that you need to take into account. Well, improved step by step, basically. So there's no such thing as we're going to do this and it's going to stay clean. Actually, I was just in a discussion with some people from my team about the traceability of some of our APIs, and I was actually changing an API, and then I figured out that the endpoint I was changing was also used in other locations that we had lost track of, and we were like, yeah, that happens, and it grows and grows, and then you need to be. The more complex it gets, the more careful you need to be, right? And but the good thing is there's lots of measurements you can take, lots of mitigating actions you can take to keep it simpler, basically. But there's a whole lot of things you need to take into account. That also means you can never do this on your own, right? I'm doing this with my team every day. And software development is basically a team sport, right? It's not an individual sport. And when you do microservices, which is one of the more complex architectural patterns you can apply, then you really need to take things into control. And a lot of companies tend to lose control over time, especially when you start going into like the third or the fourth year of doing this stuff. Then you need to keep it under control, and that is not easy, actually.
That actually touches on a lot of questions I have prepared. You just mentioned that teams, for example, tend to overestimate their scaling requirements early in the life cycle of their product. Are there things that they tend to underestimate?
Time. Like people, I have this quote on in one of my slide decks that says, which is typical for developers, right? It says, we don't do this because it is easy. We do this because we thought it would be easy, right? And that is a very good summation of what we do as developers. It's like, almost always takes more time, but then we tend to think it takes. So we always underestimate time. So we always think stuff is simpler than it is in reality. It's what we developers do, basically.
Yeah. There are like these fundamental, pretty undisputed design heuristics like separation of concerns, low coupling, high cohesion, that people generally know, and they usually are good at applying these at the level of code, at a certain detail level.
I think a lot of people not even can do that, actually. There's a talk that I do, which is called The Zen of Programming, in which I talk about how I went from super complex code written at large international banks to all the way down to writing very simple code as I do now. And even that, I'm still not at the end of it. I can write even simpler code. So I went back. So I started my career writing really simple code because I didn't know any better. And that in the 90s or 80s, 90s, I started learning about OO and design patterns and all that stuff. And then people started inventing really complex layered architectures, like up to 11 layers if you're a bank. And then when I stepped out of that, I stepped also away from that and moved to very simple code. But what I see, including the team I work with and the other teams that I work with, is that it's very hard to make code really simple. That is way harder than making code really complex, because we have the tendency of making code more complex and adding all that stuff in that we think we might need eventually. We should learn how not to do that. So the practices over time actually sort of evolved in this same direction, and that is, it's not the easiest to do, actually. Companies ask me to come in and have a look at the architecture and the way they work together, and about how they apply Agile, and about the architecture, the code, and et cetera, et cetera. And every time I do that, and that's like 5-6 times, no, it's not true, 3-4 times per year that I find the time to do small gigs like this, which I really enjoy, is that all the time you see that people make stuff more complex than they actually need. It even goes for like startups. Startups do it too. It's really weird to see that if you have no money to burn, then you still write this really complex code. When you get older, you go back to making stuff simpler instead of making more complex. Because basically, I don't have the time to make my life very complex. And the same goes for my code. I just don't have the time to make it more complex. It's way more expensive and time consuming.
I sometimes use that phrase that simplicity comes from maturity. So basically, you recognize the really experienced people in any craft because they can make it really simple.
Yes. And that's what I get with over 40 years of programming. I learned to do that. Most of the functions I write have a single statement. They're very well isolated and all very, very small, which means they become a lot easier to test, right? So writing my unit test is much easier than if you try to push it all together, right? Sometimes, I was recently at a client that had a Java Spring Boot backend. And you look at this code and you see like 4 if 4, if 4, like 15 indents in the code. And you're like, it's impossible to test this, right? No way that these people have unit tests for that, because it's impossible to do. And I said, well, why don't you pull this apart? And then they said, because it belongs all together. We don't know how to make it simpler. And that's where it ticks, right? That is where you, as somebody with experience, can help basically people with less experience in saying, well, what if you pull out this part and you put it there and you test it, and then pull out this part, put it there and test it, and then etc. Right? So breaking it down into much simpler code and architecture. That's one of the things I like a lot. Actually, my team says that I have a negative code churn on our code base, which means I do add stuff, but at the same time, I scratch a lot of code, also their code. And that's fine, right? Everybody can touch any code. We have no individual code ownership, so everybody's allowed to look at other people's code and just throw it away or improve it, usually, right? That's like, it's basically the Boy Scout or boy or Girl Scout rule, right? You leave the campsite a little bit better than you find it. And because I do that all the time, I sort of seem to have a negative code churn, which is interesting, right?
And especially since some people try to measure developer productivity, that's a holy grail.
It's not the holy grail, it's wrong.
And some people try to break it down to how much code someone produces. That would be bad news for you, I guess.
Counting lines of code is just stupid. There's no other word for it. If managers do that, they should be fired. Also, I'm very much against measuring individual productivity, because in software development, there is no such thing, right? Software development is a team sport. I cannot write code without my team. My team cannot write code without me. And everybody on the team works with everybody, which means whose code is it anyway, right? Because it's everybody's input that goes into the code. We do a lot of pair programming. We do that remotely, but also in the office. If you look at a team, it's that everybody holds a piece of the puzzle, right? Nobody has all the answers. So there's nobody who can actually write code on their own or produce value on their own, basically. And everybody needs the other people on the team in order to put stuff into production.
I have one more thing that triggered me in the abstract for your session, because I'm a DDDer. Since you mentioned it, what role does domain-driven design play in your kind of favorite mix of microservices architecture techniques?
That's a good question. It actually plays quite a vital role. And actually, it has grown from a decade of doing microservices and mixing that with a lot of other ideas, including DDD. So every one of our services is basically an aggregate, meaning it's an aggregate, it has an aggregate root, it's part of a bounded context, and an aggregate being the ideal unit of work. That's called transactions. We don't have them, but makes the aggregate the right level of doing that. So all our services are one aggregate, all of them. But what we also did is we split up the whole front end into small applications that talk to services. Each of these micro applications, as we call it, not to be confused with micro front ends, also revolves around their own aggregate. The aggregate of an app, as we call it, typically talks to a number of services and builds up their own aggregate. Like for instance, when you do in e-commerce, what we do, right? There's the basket app that we call it, which is part of our website, where stuff comes together about the order, the customer, payment, lots of other stuff. It brings it together. Basket is probably the one with the most complex domain model. So all of these apps also have their own aggregate. And that means we split up our whole website, again, also in like 20, 30 different parts. And also they have the same benefits as we have from in our services, that we can deploy them almost immediately, right? We can make a tiny change to our checkout, for instance, and we can deploy it individually of the rest without having to redeploy and re-release everything in our web app. So they benefit from the same ideas from domain-driven design as our services do, except that services talk to data and apps talk to services. That's the whole architecture idea that we have, and we've been working with that, or we, meaning me and my teams, for the last 10, 12 years, and maybe even longer before microservices, I think. And that's a pattern that I can really recommend.
Thank you, Sander. And it was a pleasure to talk to you. And I'm actually looking forward to meeting you in person in November at the Software Architecture Gathering.
Yes, let's do that.